Evolutionary novelty requires these two things, and lack of novelty, therefore, is due to one of these 4 types of constraints mentioned in the previous lecture. So first, let's look at developmental constraint. So an example of developmental constraint comes from tetrapod limbs. When we look at the patterns of digit loss in tetrapods, so that's organisms that go from having 5 fingers or toes down to 4 or 3 or 2 or 1, the pattern of the digit loss, they correlate inversely with patterns of digit development. So during development, if we're thinking about a limb developing, you have the long bone, the pair of long bones, then kind of the wrist area, and then as the digits develop, first digit 3 develops, then digit 4, and then 2, and then digits 1 and 5 develop last. So when digits are developing, the one in the middle starts, and then the ones on each side, and then the ones on the edges during the process of development for any particular individual. But then when we look at evolutionary processes, when we look at species in which they have gone from having 5 digits down to 3, it's digits 1 and 5 which are lost, and these individuals walk around with digits 2, 3, and 4. And when you look at species that have lost 4 digits and gone all the way down to just 1 digit that they use, it's always digit 3 that they're operating with. They always lose these ones first. So for example, if we look at horses, so ancestral horses had all 5 digits, and by this point we have all 4, and they lose digit 1 first, one of those last ones to develop, and then digit 5 is lost, and then digits 2 and 4 are becoming reduced and minimized, and in modern horse you have little nubs that can be slightly seen, but basically horses run around on digit 3. The first one to develop is the last one left when evolution causes the loss of digits. And we don't see any species that has gone down to 1 digit using digit 1 or 5. It's always digit 3. This is a constraint, and it kind of makes sense, because during the developmental sequence, if these 2 digits require the presence of this one to develop, you're never going to have a mutation that eliminates this that doesn't also eliminate those. And if digits 1 and 5 require the presence of 2, 3, and 4, then you're never going to have a mutation that leaves you with 1 and 5 and gets rid of these, because 1 and 5 won't develop if those don't develop. So the pattern of development limits the types of novelty in terms of digits that organisms can have. Another example comes from mollusks. So I mentioned earlier, while the organisms themselves can be very complex, the shell or skeleton is always very simple. And this is because when the shell is growing, it starts off as 1 hinge, and then as it grows, the shell grows from the outer margin. There's no mechanism within development of these guys to start a new shell anywhere else. They start off with 1 hinge. They grow from the outside. They can't grow in here. Once this shell is like this part is done growing, and they can't stop and restart a new section. So because of the way the development of mollusks works, you end up with a very limited repertoire of shells where at most have a single hinge and 2 sides. You can't get organisms that have multiple shell parts in their body because of the way the development works, because it always starts from one place, develops from the edge of the shell. So the process of development of the shell has limited dramatically this aspect of mollusks, but there's no similar constraint on the development of the fleshy part of mollusks, so you get very complicated squid, octopi, and other mollusks where the shell is very small and it's the fleshy part that's doing most of the interesting evolution. Moving now to selective constraints. When we think about a selective constraint, this will be selection at one level, preventing adaptation at another. So some examples, why don't females reproduce asexually? When we thought about this before, we saw that group level selection actually beat out individual level selection. So reproducing asexually is better for female individuals, but populations where everybody is asexual go extinct much more quickly. So group level selection eliminates those populations. So you end up with selection at this level, preventing evolutionary adaptations here that would be good for those individuals. When we thought about why altruism isn't widespread, it was actually the converse, where selection on individuals that are selfish causes them to do better in those populations. So that actually beats out group level selection, because it's essentially impossible for groups to all be altruistic and cooperative without selfish individuals invading and doing better and thereby undermining the group. Another example of a selective constraint is why there aren't really any super diseases. So here's a movie called Contagion. In this movie, there's a disease that kills people very quickly, spreads all over the world, but we don't really see that. We have diseases that scare people and kill some people, Ebola, HIV, that sort of thing, but we don't see diseases that kill large numbers of people very, very quickly. And why is that? Group selection at the level of host prevents prolonged individual selection. So if you have selection for a disease to be really virulent, where it kills an individual very, very quickly, it will kill its host so quickly that that host is unable to spread it to other individuals. So any viruses or bacteria that evolve to have that trait of virulence will then be selected against the level of groups. The hosts that have those more virulent diseases will die before they can pass them on. The diseases that are less virulent will actually do better. And in fact, there's evidence, both in the more recent Ebola and older evidence in HIV, that the long-term evolutionary process for these things is to evolve to be less virulent, less deadly, because that allows them to actually be transmitted for longer periods of time. The groups of viruses that kill their hosts more slowly actually do better. Our next evolutionary constraint based on selection we'll term functional. So if we think about it, it's actually kind of a mystery why whales don't have gills, right? Whales spend all their life in water, they dive deep. Whales do drown, right? Especially if they get trapped under ice, they can actually drown because they need to get to the surface to breathe. And gills are actually really easy to evolve, right? The gill is not a sophisticated structure, it's just a finely divided set of tissue with blood supplied to it. So why haven't whales evolved gills? Any mutant whale that had gills you would think would do much better because it could dive deeper, it could stay underwater, it wouldn't have to face the risk of suffocation or drowning. Why haven't whales evolved gills? So I actually recommend that you pause this right now and try to figure out what the answer is before I say what it is. So why gills haven't evolved in whales is because if we think about it, endothermy, right? Whales are warm-blooded. This causes a constraint when you're in an aqueous environment that's much colder. So the way gills work is by putting blood right up against the water so that oxygen can be exchanged. But if you are a warm-blooded animal, then you would lose all your body heat and you would quickly go into hypothermia. So if we think about the things that do have gills, they're all cold-blooded, ectothermic organisms. Endothermic organisms can't have gills. In fact, they have to cover themselves in very thick layers of fat in order to survive in water. It's another question, why are the biggest terrestrial insects and arthropods so small? Right? If you think about it, the biggest insects are really not much bigger than the smallest dogs, right? Well, the smallest dogs are basically much bigger than any insect. So many species of insects, so many species of arthropods, but the biggest they get are actually crabs in the ocean. The ones living on land don't really usually get very big at all, so why is this? And again, useful to take a few minutes to try to figure this out yourself before we go to the answer. So the answer to this is, as a body becomes larger, the exoskeleton must become thicker, right? So the skeleton part has to become thicker. But if the body has an exoskeleton and it becomes thicker, that means there's less and less room inside for muscles and blood supply. So this limits the size of a terrestrial exoskeleton organism, because as it gets bigger and this has to get thicker to support the weight of the organism, there's less and less room inside for the kind of flesh of the organism. So we can see some analogs of this. So if we look at architecture, castles are exoskeleton buildings. The bigger they get, there's much, much less room inside. If you actually go to one of these towers, there's hardly any room inside to move around. When we make really big buildings, we make them with endoskeletons, right? The skeleton for this building is on the inside. All the space for doing anything is on the outside. So you don't actually see things like the scene from Starship Troopers where there's this giant insect running after this guy, because its shell would have to be so thick to be that large that there would be no room inside for any organs or blood vessels or anything like that. You'll be pleased to hear that you can actually make a mathematical argument for the sizes of limbs and bodies. If not thinking about exoskeleton, now we're thinking about endoskeletons. So let's do a simple example of this. So let's think about an organism that's kind of like a cube on legs. As it gets bigger, how thick are these limbs going to have to be to support the weight of this body? So as the length of the body increases, the volume increases as the cube of the length, right? The mass is length times width times height. So the mass would increase as the cube. And this idea is not a brand new one. Goes all the way back to Jonathan Swift when he wrote Gulliver's Travels. In the book, the Lilliputians are 6 inches tall, so the king actually is given 12 cubed food rations, right? Because he is about 12 times taller, so he's given 12 times 12 times 12 times as much food. The mass of the body increases as the cube of the length. But now if we think about the limbs that these things are on, well, the strength of this limb is based on the cross-sectional area. And the cross-sectional area of something like this, the strength of that limb is going to be determined by the square of the radius. So we have a situation where the mass of the body goes up as the cube, but the strength of the limb only goes up as a square, which means the bigger and bigger an organism gets, the thicker and thicker relative to the body the limbs would have to get. For example, doubled in size here, the mass would go up by 8 times, so you need to have the square root of 8 times thicker limbs, which is almost 3 times thicker. So when the body doubles, the limbs would have to triple in thickness. So here are some examples from the movies, one that's inaccurate and one that's better. So this is a T-Rex, about the size of the limb proportions. When they made Godzilla, which is much bigger than a T-Rex, they gave it these thin limbs as well, which is totally unrealistic, because if the body is that much more massive, those limbs would have to be thicker relative to the size of the body. But when they made this movie Mighty Joe Young, here's a normal-sized gorilla. You can see how thick its limbs are in proportion to its body. When they created a fictional gorilla here that's much larger, right here it is picking up a person, they actually did make these limbs much thicker proportional to the body, which is what would have to happen on land if things are supporting themselves. But in water, gravity is less of a factor. So this is why you actually see the largest exoskeleton creatures are actually aquatic, right? The biggest things with exoskeletons are actually very large crabs, and the biggest animals in general are whales because they don't have to fight gravity. This whole exoskeleton and limb thickness argument is based on having to fight gravity because the strength of these limbs has to be able to keep up with the increasing mass of the body. You can make a very similar argument for the sizes of wings. So again, we'll think about a bird, think of them as a cube, and think about the wings. The wings are determined by the width of the wing and the length of the wing. The thickness does not contribute to the lifting power. So again, if you had a cube body here and you increased the mass is going up as the length cubed, surface area of the wing is based on the length of the body and then kind of the wing length here. As this increases, this will increase at the same rate as this, but this then has to keep up with the square of the length of the body in order to kind of keep up, to keep the surface area of the wing up with the mass. So as you increase the size of a bird, the wings actually have to get much longer in proportion to the body. So you have the same sort of thing where the body proportions will change as the organism gets bigger. So if you look at basically the smallest birds there are, so we've got hummingbirds, and you can see how their wing and actually not much longer than their body. And then if we go to a condor or a vulture type of organism, the wing is much, much larger in surface area than the size of the body, and that's because of this disproportionate change in the length of these wings as the mass goes up by a cube. And these things act as functional constraints, right? There is a maximum size to a bird because as the mass is going up as the cube, the wing has to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and at a certain point, the wing would have to be so large that it would become impossible for the bird basically to exist because it would be all wing. Our final evolutionary constraint we'll term pleiotropic constraint. kind of example we'll look at here is why do almost all mammals have 7 cervical vertebrae. So here's a giraffe, 7 cervical vertebrae, and then here's a marine mammal with essentially no neck, but it also has 7 cervical vertebrae. So why do giraffes have the same number as these guys? You would think that actually it would be beneficial to have a more flexible neck. And there's not a functional physics reason why they couldn't have more vertebrae, because if you go and look at birds, birds do have many more vertebrae. But mammals all have 7, whether or not they have necks or a long neck. So why is this? Well, some interesting data comes from a study by Fritz and Gallus. So her rationale goes as follows. So there are genes called Hox genes. They're involved in axial patterning. So during development, they tell parts of the body what to develop into. They are transcription factors. Hox genes are also involved in regulating general cell proliferation, so general cell growth in the body. Now, Hox genes, during development, they tell the body, okay, this portion of the body will develop into the neck, this portion of the body develops into the thorax, this portion of the body develops into the abdomen, and then they also have this function. So the sorts of mutations that you would have to change cervical vertebrae into other vertebrae would be Hox genes, but Hox genes also have this effect on general cell growth. So it may well be that mutations here that could give you different cervical vertebrae would also kind of mess up the control of cell growth, and cell growth being messed up is what cancer is. When you look at human children with embryonic cancers, so this is actually cancer before they're even born, when you look at those individuals, they actually have 125 times higher risk of having cervical ribs. So that's actually their cervical vertebrae not developing the cervical vertebrae, but actually developing into thoracic vertebrae. Human children born with cervical ribs, so that's having ribs on the cervical vertebrae. So again, during development, something has changed with the axial patterning. Those individuals have 120 times higher risk of having early childhood cancer. So there's this connection between mutations that change the nature of cervical vertebrae and cancer, probably caused by the fact that these genes are doing both of these things, right? Regulating what part of the body develops into what part, but also regulating cell growth. When we look at taxa that have more cervical vertebrae, the ones that have evolved a different number of cervical vertebrae, we actually notice that they have lower metabolic rates and cancer rates. And this actually kind of makes sense because increasing the risk of cancer in an organism that essentially has no risk of cancer is not actually going to be much of a fitness detriment. So in birds and reptiles and amphibians that have very low metabolisms and very low cancer risks, the sorts of mutations in their Hox genes that could change their number of cervical vertebrae would probably not be as negative because they're just changing the risk of cancer, which is already so low that that's not really relevant. There are 2 mammals that have a different number of cervical vertebrae, and those are manatees and sloths, which are essentially the 2 lowest metabolism mammals, right? So again, in the counterexamples that we have for mammals not evolving a different number of cervical vertebrae, they are the exact organisms that maybe could handle increased cancer risk from their baseline because their baseline is so low. So what seems to be happening is that pleiotropy, so that is genes with more than one effect, pleiotropy of the Hox genes prevents the evolution of novel number of cervical vertebrae in taxa that have cancer risk that can then be multiplied and actually lead to real fitness costs. This pleiotropy of the Hox genes prevents evolution of new numbers of cervical vertebrae in taxa with cancer risk, which is basically mammals that have high metabolisms, or at least metabolism, not these guys. So why is it that mammals don't evolve a different number of cervical vertebrae? It's not that mutations can't occur that provide those traits, and it's not like those traits are not physically possible and able to work. It's that because those mutations would typically have side effects that are even worse than the benefit they would get, we don't see that sort of evolution. So we have a pleiotropic constraint that limits evolution in at least this case, and because pleiotropy is actually very common throughout the genome, you could imagine there may be lots and lots of traits where it would be advantageous to have a change, but the side effects would be worse, and so that's going to limit the evolution that can occur. So when we look at our evolutionary constraints, we have developmental constraints with our example of the digits. We have different selective constraints. So individual level selection beating out group selection in hyenas, gene level selection beating out individual level selection in mice. groups actually beating out individual and gene-level selection in the evolution of sex, which we saw earlier. We have functional constraints, gills and maximum size of organisms, and we have pleiotropic constraints, for example, with our cervical vertebrae. So while a lot of evolution has occurred over evolutionary history, the amount that's occurred and the traits that we've seen are actually a small fraction of maybe what could have been if we didn't have these constraints. And in fact, in the next part of the course, we'll see that stochasticity and just chance also acts not necessarily as a constraint, but it has also dramatically reduced the amount of evolution that has occurred compared to what could have occurred if evolution wasn't prone to constraints and random chance.